The scandal of grace, and we're going to take our time, or take some time at least, to look at what I call the comfort of shame. I don't know if there was yesterday. Let's see, Sunday there was a church meeting in here, and so the two projectors are now. Well, the one computer is hijacked mine, so I can't use it. And you'd think with all the money we put into the technology in this building. Anyway, that being said, no, I ain't going any farther with that. Since it's being recorded, I'm going to have to edit it out now as it is. So, yeah. Anyway, any questions or conversations you've had, or interesting comments you've heard, or anything of that sort over the last few days? All right. That was profound. If you want more silence, just come on the silent retreat. Let me pray and let's get started. Father, thank you for this day. Thanks for the beauty where we live and being able to have a cool, crisp morning in February and the snow on the ground and all. We seem to just kind of pass through our world and take so much for granted that is really all grace. But in spite of that, as we walk through and look at some of the things that are related to the things that steal our sense of the gift that you've given us, help us just to pay attention and to not sink into more shame just thinking about it. Give us the strength that we need and the space we need to look, but then also just kind of give ourselves the time and the space to be able to change and to do things a little bit differently. It doesn't have to be huge changes. It's just enough change that indicates how much we trust you in our lives. In Jesus' name, amen. Okay, so what I want to do, this, like I said, this one is referred to as the comfort of shame. We looked at the scandal of grace, and I wanted to add something. I thought of it yesterday, just to say, or to at least explain why I called it the scandal of grace. Does anybody in here know where the word scandal comes from? Anyone? Bueller? The scandal, the Greek word is scandalon, or scandalos, depending on, I'm not really sure what the differences are, but that being said, scandalon simply means stumbling block. That was the word that was used when Jesus referred to the stone that the builders rejected would become a stumbling block. Grace is a stumbling block. It's a stumbling block for people outside of the faith and people inside of the faith. Because the problem for most of us when we look at having a gift given to us, we hate being obligated. We talked a little bit about that last time. And because of that obligation, then, even if it's to God, even if it's to somebody that has immense resources beyond our imagination, we still feel like we have to do something to earn it. And that's what a lot of Christians' lives have turned into, is a continuing effort to prove that they're worthy of a gift that's been given, which, I think I mentioned it last time, that essentially when we do that, it's pretty insulting to the gift giver. Now, that's not a motivation, and it really isn't an invitation to shame either, but it is an insult, because the gift is given freely so that we can accomplish the things that is said in terms of working out our salvation with fear and trembling. Remember that word, did I mention this last time? The idea of fear and trembling. When we hear that phrase, it ends up kind of in provoking in us this idea that I'll somehow do it wrong. And fear and trembling doesn't carry with it that understanding at all in Scripture, certainly in the original Greek. The idea is be in awe that God actually locked arms with you to be a part of your change. That's more accurate. And the flip side of that is Paul says that, so participate, engage in, be a part of the redemption that God is bringing about in our lives. But it also, on the flip side, is whatever God has started, He will complete it in Christ. So it's two sides of the same coin. We are to engage the process, otherwise known as sanctification, but at the same time, God will see fit and see to it that it comes to completion by the end of our lives. So with the whole idea of shame, and like I said in my prayer, you got to be careful that when we start talking about this stuff, this is not an invitation into more shame. That's hard. That's really hard, because the stuff I'm going to say is not easy to hear, because it convicts everybody. And I can tell you that because that was my Sunday night. I was writing down things, and I would write something down, an idea had come to me, or somebody had written something that I thought I wanted to include, and I'd sit back in my chair and go, oh crap, I missed that one too. So one of the first questions I want to ask is where does its power come from? Why is shame so compelling to us that we seem to gravitate that direction? And I'm going to kind of disengage myself from culture, disengage myself from all the other things that we tend to think about, look at when we talk about shame, because we tend to look out. We say, yeah, people are shame throwers, or whatever that is that's going on out in the world around us, and it is. The world we live in is completely graceless. It is a law-based, legalistic world that we live in. So that being said, the question is, where does the power come from? And the first thing we have to talk about is our identity. It showed up in the word cloud we did, right? We did shame, and people said motivating, and they said a lot of different things. But the one word that did not show up, or did show up there, was identity. Didn't show up in grace, but it did show up in shame. And when something is connected, that intimately connected to who we are, it's going to be pretty compelling. As a matter of fact, it actually tempts us into thinking we can find a shortcut to changing who we are. That's why it's so useful. So the other part of it is what we're not even aware of is we use it on two different frames. One is we use it to change other people's behavior, and we use it to protect ourselves. Now the question would be, how do I do that? That doesn't make sense. I'm using something that's not positive, that's negative, to protect myself. But there's a part of that motivation in there that we can talk about even in psychology that we call active mastery, and that is, I will hurt me before you hurt me. And the pain and the misery that I inflict on myself is far better than any pain or misery that you inflict on me. We do that with shame, and it insulates us from anything coming at us. The flip side is challenging you, which I said at the very first day of class, is challenging you to pay attention to your words in your relationships with friends, in terms of how we do that with other people. The class yesterday, I showed them the scandal of grace part of this talk, and we went through the three scenes from the Les Mis, and they were all completely Twitter-pated. It's like a scene out of Bambi or something. They of course, that's where the word came from, right? You guys know that? Yeah, it came from Bambi. Anyway, they were so Twitter-pated, and I got caught because we were joking, and my usual snarky, sarcastic self. And I said, "You guys are pathetic." Somebody said, "Stop throwing shame at us." Oh yeah. There you go. Poster child me. So we've got to be mindful of how that works and what it does. The other thing that it does, and again, I want to talk about its power first before we try to unpack this thing. So it deals with our identity, it protects us, and in some sense, when I'm pushing somebody away, I'm also protecting me. Okay, even when I push shame out on somebody, I'm protecting myself. But the third thing it does is it is directly connected to our sense of belonging. So not only is it connected to my identity, it's also connected to and threatens my sense of belonging. So what comes out of this are feelings, threatened feelings of being alone, of being cast out, of being rejected for who we are, not what we do. Okay? In other words, being rejected for our being, not for our behavior. And those three things are directly related to our belonging, which means that if I say, or I make the calculation in my head, wait a minute, I don't want to have these feelings, therefore what will I do? And we talked a little bit about that when we were talking about safe people and so forth. We then concoct a trade. And the trade is, I will trade my belonging to you for your approval of me. And whether you say it or not, the fact that you stay in relationship with me is a vote of approval. And so we get it. That's why trades, and we'll talk about this later in the semester, that's why trades are so compelling. Because it just is equal for equal, quid pro quo, and that's part of understanding it. The other one, the other place and the power that it has is we lack the vocabulary to describe it. We don't have a very good vocabulary when it comes right down to it. Most people, I think it's safe to say, most people grow up in families that have a pretty truncated feeling vocabulary. All right. Now, what do I mean by that? Mad, sad, glad, bad, scared. 5 categories. And they don't really develop it other than the extremes. So glad, the extreme would be ecstasy, to be so overjoyed and excited that I can barely contain myself. And the other end of that is the sadness part. We don't have a vocabulary for shame. We don't know how to describe it. We can experience it, but we really don't know how to describe it very well. And so without the words to describe it, we lack the ability to expose it. That's the key. And that's the strategy ultimately for defeating shame, which is exactly why many of us stay stuck. Because exposing it means what? Threatening my belonging. Threatening my sense of connectedness to people. So I'm in this incredible double bind. And you all are familiar with the idea of a double bind. Damned if I do and damned if I don't. No matter which way I go, I'm going to face a problem here. So there's that part of it. Without words, we lack the ability to even respond to it. So if I don't have the words to describe it, and to actually identify what it is and bring it into relationship and expose it, then I don't know how to describe it and I don't know how to respond to it. One of the things that I've mentioned so many times in my classes before, a lot of you guys have heard me say this, is our interior language is a lot more important than you think it is. Interior language, okay? We can always edit our exterior language, but our interior language is what's so important. And in so much of the time that I've spent talking to people, I oftentimes are not necessarily listening. This is, I suppose, a very little secret. I'm not necessarily listening to what they're talking about. I'm very empathic. I do listen, I promise. But I do listen for how they describe it. The words they use to describe it. And that's a telltale. It's a tell. It's a telltale sign of how they think about it, and that's what we're lacking oftentimes when we talk about shame. We've got lots of words. If we go back to the previous thing we talked about with grace, we've got lots of words, theological, wonderfully flowery words about grace. With shame, because it is such a charged topic, we don't dare define it. it's like defining our worst monster, okay? Our worst enemy. When I had people in counseling that wrestled with anxiety and so forth, I had a little parable that I used to have that I would give them. It was called Kiss Your Monster on the Nose. And it was a little parable about a little girl who lived with her grandparents, and they lived in this valley, and the grandparents, one of them became deathly ill, and the only way to get the medicine necessary to take care of it was that she had to go out of the valley, over the mountains, to get to a village on the other side to get the medicine necessary for her grandmother to be healed. So she takes off, thinks she's all that and more, and takes off and gets to a crossroads, and what she finds on the crossroads is on one place is a monster that is standing there growling at her, and the other crossroads looks overgrown and awful and terrible, but at least there's no monster there. So she takes off this direction, and it takes her way, way, way off the path, through the brambles, through all sorts of having to bust her way through, knowing kind of where she's going and everything else. And she realized, I'm not going to make it by nightfall. I have got to get there by nightfall. So she retraces her steps back to the fork in the road. And again, the monster's there growling and is doing everything necessary to what she perceives as intimidating her. And she takes it upon herself to go up to the monster and kiss it. And the monster changes and says, I was only growling so that you might come toward me and go down the right path. And she makes it to the village, comes back, blah, blah, blah. All's well that ends well. Okay? And in a lot of cases, the monster in our lives is shame. And we don't want to get anywhere near it or define it, because if we do, I will be saddled with it the rest of my life. In psychology, you call it catastrophic thinking. So there's a lot of stuff about this that is very much upside down when we take a look at it. The other part of this is, without the words, we don't develop the ability then to engage in self-monitoring. See, if I don't have the words, and I'm not going to define it, and I'm not going to pay attention and pull back and monitor what's going on, how am I going to change? I can't. I really can't change, because I have no basis of identification. One of the keys that Brené Brown talks all the time is critical awareness. Well, sometimes, for a lot of us, we have to even go steps backwards and say, how do I develop critical awareness? I have to develop the vocabulary and the ability to actually see it before I can actually develop this awareness idea. Okay? And that's a lot of what we have to do when we're talking about shame and where it comes from. So, let's answer the question, what is it? Okay? One definition is shame is an intensely painful feeling, and I'll pause because I know you don't have anything to write from. Shame is an intensely painful feeling or experience of believing we are flawed. Okay? Shame is an intensely painful feeling or experience of believing we are flawed, and therefore unworthy of acceptance and belonging. Okay, I'll say it again. Shame is an intensely painful feeling or experience of believing we are flawed and therefore unworthy of acceptance and belonging. Now, the thing that we have to unpack in all of that is that there are at least 4 different feeling states that are part of this landscape. And we'll unpack the definition a little bit more in a minute. But the first four, the ones that tend to come to mind when we're talking about this subject is embarrassment and guilt and humiliation and shame. Brené Brown makes the comment that these are 4 different feeling states. They are not the same. They have some commonalities between them, but they are not the same. Okay, so embarrassment, guilt, humiliation, and shame. Now, embarrassment, let me get a couple of things out of the way. Embarrassment, by definition, is temporary. It is not something that sticks around for very long. It's fleeting. You don't open the door far enough and you run into the edge of the door. It's embarrassing, okay? It's the kind of thing that if you look back on it, you do what you guys just did. You chuckle and say, that was dumb. That's embarrassment. Yes, that. It is very normal, and like I said, often humorous when we go back and look at it and think about it. So embarrassment is not, it's not a fatal state for most of us because we've connected it with shame. It is. Because we're sure everybody's watching us run into the door. When most of the people are going, somebody will run into there. Who cares? Go on, move. There's something else to do here. Okay? Guilt and shame, right? We'll take the other two that we're most interested in. Guilt and shame, the one thing they have in common is that they are both states that are built on self-evaluation. That's the one thing that they have, guilt and shame have in common. It's built on how I evaluate myself and what I do. So guilt, and you guys have read this, so this shouldn't come as any surprise. As a matter of fact, you should be writing it down right now before I say it. If I make the distinction between guilt and shame, what's the difference? Yeah, guilt is about my behavior, and shame is about my being. Another way to put it, guilt is about my performance, and shame is about my person. Hence the power. A lot of you guys are in or have had human sexuality. We talk a lot about personhood in there. And it is the essence of who we are, not only in terms of the imago Dei, God's image in us, but everything about us. We don't think in person terms. We really don't. And watch our relationships with one another a lot of times and you'll see it. But we think more in terms of performance. And remember last time when I was talking about the one thing that you heard from in the scandal of grace part was this idea of grace in the well. Performance is all the downstream stuff. Okay? It's all the downstream stuff. We would much prefer clear out the downstream stuff and presume that if I do, it will deal with what's coming out of the well. Clearly it doesn't. That's why so many people get caught in cycles that they can't seemingly get out of because they're constantly trying to deal with the downstream stuff rather than deal with the stuff in the well, which is person. Your person is the wellspring of life. That is where God resides. And so I already said that performance, the thing to keep in mind here is that guilt is built on our performance, and the other key criteria or aspect of it is it's relatively easily changed. Okay? Guilt is because it's based on performance. So if I don't do something right, I make some adjustments, I try it again, and I change my performance. It's relatively easy. And so guilt, one way to think about this is guilt is comparing our behaviors, all right, don't switch it to being. It's comparing our behaviors to our values and our ethics and our beliefs. And again, you've probably read this in Brené Brown. That's where guilt comes from. I lied to somebody. I feel convicted about it, and I say, ouch, I don't like that I do that. I will change that behavior. I will speak the truth. That's a relatively easy change. We can make those changes without too much trouble. In Christian terms, we talk about conviction, just like I did there. This shame, on the other hand, like I said, is about our person. And that is not easily changed. Okay? We are not equipped to care for the well. it is far easier to give you a 12-step plan to deal with the behavior downstream than to explore and deal with the well, because there are depths and places in there we would rather not visit. So some of you have heard me describe people, various people and how they live life as the people, the water bug people, and the people that live below the surface. Well, when you think about a lake or anything else, where's the real nutrients? Down below, underneath the surface. But people that live on the surface, the water bugs, life is good. Everything's fine. I don't have to deal with all that nastiness that's down there in that well. And yet, it's still overflowing, and I still see downstream behaviors that I don't like, and I'll try to deal with those behaviors without dealing with the stuff in the well. And that's a prime thing to keep in mind. We all of us at some level know it's harder to change a well than it is to change the debris downstream. All of us know that. And so when we start feeling shame about our being, it's like, oh crap, I'm sunk. Because I don't know where to start. It scares the spit right out of me to even think about it. I'll go downstream a ways and deal with it that way in terms of behavior. So, continuing on in terms of talking about what is it, shame is about our person. It's about exposure. All right, and I want to kind of describe different aspects of it here. We've already defined it as a statement about my person and my personhood. But the key thing to this is it's about exposure. The very easiest way to describe it, and this is straight out of some of the interviews that Brene Brown did, is having the mask pulled off and all the judged and condemned parts of me being shown. That's the exposure we're talking about. The second thing I already mentioned about being cast out, it's about being the outsider and feeling the outsider. This is the one that I would point out to you again, where Jesus understands it far better than you think he does. Because he was ostracized through most of his life. And so we've got that, and then lastly, it's about self-loathing. And self-loathing is a far bigger term than meets the eye. It's not just self-hate. It's not just self-hate. It's deeper than that. It's a self-loathing, and it's an understanding why people hate me too. That's the key underlying shame and its power. So, it's about exposure, it's about being ostracized, and it's about the idea of self-loathing. That's not a word necessarily that Brown uses, but from all the years of sitting and talking to people, that's the word that seems to capture it the most in the times that I've spent talking to people. So, the other thing is, the other term, so we had shame, guilt, humiliation, and embarrassment. Embarrassment's temporary. Look back on it, it's kind of funny, everybody does it. Shame and guilt, shame's about our person, guilt's about our shame, or guilt is about our behavior, our performance, guilt is about our person. Humiliation is unique in the sense that it's moving, what it does, and this is how it works, it moves all the ruthless words and things that are in us, and it pushes it out into the public domain and makes somebody a target to put it on them, okay? So humiliation is a firm and undeniable attempt to diminish the other person in the public domain. One quote I ran across by a writer once, he basically said, people believe they deserve their shame, but they don't believe they deserve humiliation. See, that's another level. Why? because it puts it at the level and strikes at the place where that I'm trying to connect and belong with people, and then it diminishes me and then turns into then a continuing cycle of shame. For people that end up growing up in families that use this as a means of controlling behavior, they just simply internalize the humiliation into that cycle of shame. Okay? So there's an interaction effect between these two things. We've been in various situations where somebody is humiliating us, and they find all the right things to say and do that disconnect us from the people around us, and they single us out and diminish us. And that's humiliation. Okay? Embarrassment, walking into a door, we will use the word, that's humiliating, when in fact, last I checked, the door is not saying, you're a really idiot. No, I'm saying that. And that's the biggest challenge in all of this stuff, is I've got to be clear about who's saying what to whom. Okay? Because we can behave in particular ways and someone will look at us a particular way or sigh a particular way, and we're already down into the cycle of shame. It takes very, very little for us to get there. So, again, the next question here is, how do we experience this thing? And there are 3 different domains in which we experience shame. And there usually is, I think Brown talks about in, her books are all fusing in my mind, webs, shame webs. Did she mention that? Which one is it, Gifts or Daring Greatly? I think it's Daring Greatly, yeah. The problem with webs is they tend to be 2-dimensional. They're not 3-dimensional. What we have with shame is we have something that's a layering effect, where, if you've ever, there was an old game that was, what was it called? It was 3 levels of playing tic-tac-toe. You guys know what I mean? Have you ever seen that before? So whatever move you make on whatever plane affects all the other planes. Okay? So you have a tic-tac-toe on the top, and the middle, and the bottom. You make a move on the bottom, it affects the middle and the top, and suddenly you have to think 3-dimensionally. All right? That's closer to what we're talking about with shame. There is a layering effect of shame, and in each layer there are 3 different sets of expectations, because we have social expectations, community kind of expectations, and then we also have those expectations compete with one another, which goes back to the notion, what I said before, with a double bind. So the layers have different expectations of who we are, what we are, and how we should be. Those are your 3 layers. Okay? And one of the things that Brown talks about, and I know she talks about in Daring Greatly, is the idea that genders react to who we are differently, very differently. If you were to go back and read I Thought It Was Me and It Wasn't, it was her first book that was written primarily for women, and she looks at 6 different areas about who we should be. I think she mentions in Daring Greatly that she came to the realization that men experience that very differently than women do. But the thing about who we should be, we have an extra layer partly because of our faith. Because being a Christian, being a Christ follower, adds an extra set of oftentimes competing expectations. Like, what is weakness versus what is strength? What is being assertive and what is not? What is being a leader and what is being a follower? All of those things are embedded even in our Christian culture, and it goes to like the idea of Christ-likeness. I mean, most of the time when I use that phrase, I don't know how many people, for me, the minute I think of that, I'm supposed to be perfect. That's what comes to my mind. And if that's the level, I'm sunk. Even this morning, I'm sunk all the way. So the whole idea of Christ-likeness ends up adding into these expectations that we have of who we are, what we are, and how we should be. How do I relate? Well, in the 80s and 70s and 80s, there was a very popular book that we used to get a wristband for, WWJD. Right? What would Jesus do? Well, the bigger question is, what would Jesus do with my life? Not what he would do. And even probably the most telling question is not what Jesus would do. What would Jesus say? I mean, in light of what we're talking about with our thinking, what would Jesus say? And we have some clues. We have clues of what Jesus would say. I dare say that it's not even close to what we tend to say when somebody comes to us when they're struggling. And we say, failed again, more shame. All right, back to regular programming. So a couple other things I thought of was being above reproach, the idea of being above reproach, the idea of and I've heard a lot of Christians, sometimes the older ones, boomers, about representing Jesus to a society. What would people think of Jesus? Well, I don't know. And the second thing is you probably don't have a whole lot of impact on it. Because you can't control what people think. You can control about the choices you make, about how you behave, and what you do with your will, and all the other things that I was telling you about. And if you take care of that stuff, then they will walk away saying, oh, that's what Jesus is. So, who we should be is very different for men and women. Men have a lot of what we might call double binds in terms of what does a strong man look like and what does a weak man look like. We tend to think in terms of very dichotomous terms, and most of them are double binds. And that's one of the reasons why, and you probably have heard it from preachers and other people, they're busting guys for being passive. And I'd say they're not passive, they're paralyzed. They can't figure out which demand to meet. Because if they're strong, somehow they become domineering. And if they're weak, they're passive. How do they get out of that double bind? Well, usually they don't. So they find the route of least resistance. And usually it's defined, a lot of times, by the women in their lives. Women, on the other hand, have exactly the same problem, except a very different one. I had this conversation with my daughter. We were driving home from church, and our church at least is on what they call a man series. And she has 2 little boys at home. And she said, I am scared in raising 2 boys. And I said, yeah, you should be. But I said, the world's a different place than it was when I grew up, certainly. And her husband grew up in a place where there were absolutely no definitions of what manhood was at all. So our tendency is to teach what we know, not what we've learned. And the biggest challenge she and I talked about was, how do we figure out, the standard, if you will, of biblical manhood and womanhood for that matter, and being able to infuse that into them as they grow up. It's not easy, because the prevailing culture says, for men at least, whatever we teach them to do that would be providers and protectors is toxic masculinity. So we're between a rock and a hard place. Here we are all over again. My daughter was then reflecting on, man, the world was different when I was growing up, and I was a girl, and I had all of these expectations. I said, yeah, you're right. A lot more than your boys probably might experience, because of the messages that women experience around body image and behavior and modesty and all the other things that go with it. And all of this is who we should be. Who we should be that contributes to it. The idea of what we should be is, I wrote down what's a godly woman, for example, or what's a godly man, what we should be. we end up with very undefined ideals that nobody ever sits down and says, well, let's fashion something close. And the last one is how we should be, and that's everything about our relationships. The irony is how we should be, in spite of the fact that it's listed last, provides the context for all the others. Because it's in the context of relationships that we figure out what and who we should be. And that's more powerful than I think we suspect. The other way that we experience it is just simply the word fear. Fear. We're biologically, emotionally, cognitively, and spiritually designed to be connected. That's called the Imago Dei. We are relational beings. It's in our DNA biologically and spiritually. So when a device, if you want to call it that, of shame enters our world, where does it split us? On connectedness. And fear results. And fear comes out of it. So how do we experience that? We get it through ridicule. Sometimes people can be sarcastic and insensitive and hit on something. They don't know what the button is, but they hit it. So ridicule, feeling diminished, and we've got to go back to that word I used about the intense feeling of being so flawed that we're not worthy of being acceptable. Now think that through for a minute. I don't think there's a single person sitting in this room that would say, yeah, no, I'm not flawed. If you are, trade me places. So it's common to all of us. The issue is how flawed? How flawed? How flawed do you have to be before you're finally unacceptable? And generally speaking, we think in very all or nothing terms. Either I'm flawed or I'm not. So the how flawed thing is not quite as relevant. If we're pushed, we'll probably try to push it into some kind of continuum, but I'm not sure that's how we experience it. And most of us, when we get really down to the final push of being honest, I am so flawed that I am not worthy, and then when people show me worth and dignity, what do? I erect a wall and make sure that it doesn't get in because it doesn't match what I've already concluded about myself. And the one thing Brene Brown says, and you've read, and I'll just repeat it all over again, shame flourishes in darkness. That's why we're going to be talking about the stained glass self. Because there's just enough light to see, but it's just dark enough to keep shame alive and well. Okay, the other thing is, and I already got ahead of it a little bit, but what I called it the double bind. Everybody experiences the double bind. This is another element of how we experience shame. The idea of double bind, here's a definition. It's a situation in which options are limited, okay, they're limited, and all of them expose us to penalty, censure, or deprivation. Okay, so options are limited. A situation where all the options are limited, and all of them expose us to penalty, censure, or deprivation. It's called a double bind. Something that we have found out, at least even in psychology, is there is a way to break a double bind. And probably the quickest way is the way that we all hate, is expose it. So if somebody comes up and basically asks me of something that would ask me to do something that would violate my beliefs, and makes it a criteria for being in relationship with them, I'm in a double bind. Either my beliefs, I follow that, or I sacrifice that to be able to keep the relationship. The other term we have in psychology is cognitive dissonance, right? How do we resolve that? The problem is we try to reconcile it, and it results in us doing pretty much nothing, usually. Rather than saying, I feel like you're asking me to compromise on something that I believe really, really strongly in, and it's going to jeopardize my relationship with you. Suddenly, something changes because you have exposed it. A double bind cannot exist in the light very well. It will. You know, there was a theory in psychology at one point, actually family therapy, that referred to as schizophrenogenic families. It was out of a group out of Palo Alto, and their theory is that there was a particular communication style in these families that actually contributed to schizophrenia. Now, it was obviously debunked because we've got, not debunked entirely, but because of all that we've learned in the biological realm and the psychological realm and so forth. But the thing that caught my attention about that was that the way that they described the communication in the family was they used a scenario. And the scenario was the son had been admitted because he had a psychotic break to the psych hospital, and his mother comes to visit him. And he's on not on a pass, but visitation, and she comes walking down the hallway, and he kind of quickens his pace, gets closer and closer, and throws his arms around her to give her a hug, and she stiffens. Now think for a minute, what happens in you when you feel that in somebody? And then he drops his arms and backs up, and she says, "Why, son, don't you love your mother?" A double bind. He lost by giving her a hug because she rejected it by stiffening, as if, don't do that. And then when he doesn't do that, now he's not being a loving son. We have lots of double binds. And usually, in order to resolve it, we don't. We don't. We just say, yeah, whatever. It is what it is. Whatever phrase that we tend to use. But when we experience shame and fear, blame is not very far behind. We will either deflect it, make somebody else responsible, or we'll use the blame as a way of dealing with these feelings that you all felt when I was describing that, of powerlessness. Well, if you weren't such a jerk as a mother, I wouldn't have to go through all this nonsense. Blame. Yeah.
So we talk about speaking these double binds in a relationship, and like that example, but what if the person you're in a relationship with doesn't know you're putting double binds on? How do you speak that without putting shame on them, without being like, well, you're doing this and it doesn't match up with what I believe in, and they're like, oh my gosh, I can't really get that, like how do you possible?
Yeah, well, and I mean, the reality is you're not going to stop the shame in them as much as you'd like to. Now, how shame doesn't flourish in light. So I can say, please don't take this as an assault. We all make mistakes. We make mistakes. So I'm only telling you this so that our relationship can get better. I'm not trying to convict you of anything. Now, that's not any guarantee. They may still walk away licking their wounds, saying what an awful person they are and how horrible, blah, 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 blah. You can't stop that. But you can, again, shame flourishes in darkness. How can I drag it into the light? And being a shame-resilient person, like Brené Brown talks about, is the person that invites you to bring it out and make a safe place for you to bring it out. And you can do that if you give somebody that kind of feedback, and you can see kind of their shoulders start to slump. Then it's probably a sure sign. Just say, wait a minute, before you run off into shame land, tell me what's going on. And a lot of times people will say something like, I failed you as a friend. And again, words matter. Because then I can say, if somebody were to say that, I can say, no, you have not failed me as a friend. You've been a human friend. You made a mistake. I get that. I do it all the time. I've eaten more shoes than I can count anymore. Let's just figure it out. That's a grace statement. Remember what I put up last time. The voice of shame is, you will always be what you have always been. The voice of grace says, I don't require anything from you, no bargains, nothing at all. You're free. You're so free that I will just help you grasp the mistake and do it differently. That's what friends are for. The other thing I want to highlight in terms of experiencing shame and fear is the idea that when we experience those things, and shame and fear generally are always going together anyway, but what it does is it steals our sense of agency. You guys know what I mean when I say agency? The ability to make things happen. We feel very powerless about that. And when these are flags that can tell you when you're experiencing shame. And one of it is I feel like there's nothing I can do. So it steals this sense of agency that we're talking about. And we have to make this distinction between two different things. Having personal power or having power over somebody. Okay? And power over somebody is generally the idea that I will define who you are and I will get you to believe that you thought it first anyway. That's power over. When somebody says, well, and even in our culture, either you're being a bigot or whatever, and that triggers our shame because who wants to be a bigot, right? And suddenly they have now power over me because they have defined me that way rather than resisting that definition. And that tends to steal our sense of agency, our sense of what you might call instrumentality. The only way to respond is to reclaim what we call personal power or true power. And like I said, personal power is the ability to act and have an effect. That's what personal power is. There are a lot of these situations that tend to prompt us to feel helpless, and we give up our ability to actually be agents in what's going on right at that moment. Okay? One of the reasons that I talk so much about the words that people use is to equip you, not to convict somebody. If you want law, go over to the school business. But why do I want to pay attention to words? Because I want to find a way to connect where they are. And if I don't know their language, I can't talk to them. I had some of you guys were in Crisis of Trauma yesterday, and I had my friend come and talk about DID. And there was something he said that kind of caught my attention, but it's common for us, the work with dissociation and DID, and that is he made mention of the fact, I don't know what kind of the language that Dr. Mitch uses, but this is what I use just to try to understand working with people with dissociation, etc. That we take for granted, just because we speak English doesn't mean we have the same language. The language in your head is the different one than you use out here. And if I want to connect with somebody, then I need to find a way to understand their language. Not mine, not what I impose on them, not what they mean, but asking them those kinds of things, which prompts us then to do that. Where are we? Time. Okay, I got time. Let me finish with the personal power thing. So, the question probably is riding up in your head, all right, wait a minute. If I'm supposed to reclaim my personal power, exactly what does that mean? Better yet, what does it look like? But what does it look like is downstream. What does it mean has everything to do with your heart. And there are three things I want to emphasize to you. First is consciousness. Being conscious, developing an ability to self-monitor what's going on within me, and understanding that when shame hits, we tend to not have the words for it, therefore we're not conscious of it. We don't label it. Some people are beginning to label that. I mean, some people are talking about, shame hangovers and shame attacks and things like that. That's a beginning. That's a beginning. But consciousness is the building block for being able to reclaim personal power, because I'm beginning to do one thing, which is really annoying for many people to hear, and that is own myself. And so consciousness is part of that, which includes the fear, the sense of being helpless, the sense of powerlessness, all of those things that come along with it. The interesting thing, and I'll end on this point, the interesting thing about that is that when we experience shame, some studies in biochemistry have suggested this, is that when we experience shame, something very different happens in our brain. We don't process it in the neocortex. In other words, we don't process it where we can evaluate it, make some decisions, and then go from there, kind of work our way through it logically. When we experience shame, it almost has a short circuit straight into the amygdala, and we go straight into fight, flight, or freeze. And there's lots of research to back it up that way. So our tendency, because we're not conscious of what's going on, that part of our brain gets disconnected, and we react to it from what I call survival mode. All that I'm worried about is getting out of this situation with the least amount of damage that I can suffer. And that's what gets in the way of maintaining our sense of agency, our sense of instrumentality, our ability to have an effect on what's going on around us. And that's really pretty key to understand, because that naturally happens to all of us. Belonging is so deeply wired into us that the minute we have a very low threshold that says this is getting threatened, and when that happens, then suddenly I'm off in survival land. And survival land leads me into boundarylessness, into saying what's necessary to get out of the situation, just doing whatever I have to. And when I'm in that mode, I'm not going to make decisions about what is good for me in this situation, not in a selfish sort of way. What's good for me in this situation, and what helps me to stay connected to the person that's important to me. By invitation, not by demand, by invitation. Okay? All right, we will stop there. I've got more, and we'll run through it next time.